So we'll continue. Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks for joining our webinar. This webinar is an introduction to ISO 27001. And so we'll be looking at how ISO 27001 works, how to implement it, and get a basic understanding of the approaches that are normally used to implement ISO 27001. And most importantly, why it is important to implement ISO 27001 as a management system. We'll continue. I'll in a short while share the agenda. And what we'll do is that we'll continue until the end, and then we'll have a question and answer session at the end so that we don't get a lot of distractions. But in case you have a burning question as I go ahead, you will just raise your hand, and then we will unmute you, and then we'll be able to ask a question. In case there is a burning question, even as we proceed, we can still be able to tackle that as we go. So just raise your hand and give your comment or raise a question. So our learning objectives are to gain a fundamental understanding of the ISO 27001 family of standards. There is the ISO 27000 family of standards, and out of which we have ISO 27001. Then we'll get an introduction of information security management standards and security objectives. We'll get to understand the requirements of ISO 27001 and how to implement them in the organization. And we'll also gain an overview of the steps that normally lead to ISO certification. Now, this is the basic agenda that we are going to look at. We look at the basics of information security so that we can understand what the basics are. We look at information security management systems. Then after that, we look at the ISO 27001 family of standards. After that, we look at an outline of ISO 27001. And then we look at the steps that are normally taken from implementation of the management system, taking somebody or an organization all the way to the point at which they get certified. Then we'll have a question and answer session, and we'll have some free coffee. We'll see about that towards the tail end of what that is going to constitute. So I'll just want to inform that we will not be going deep into the implementation of ISO 27001, but we will get a good outline of exactly how that implementation normally goes. This is normally a 5-day training. So you can imagine you are trying to compress a 5-day training into 1.5 hours. I expect for us to be able to finish within the next 1 hour and 30 minutes. So I've basically tried to compress a 5-day training into 1.5 hours. And that is not easy. So we'll basically be looking at the basics. We'll not be going into the details of how the implementation normally happens. But I do believe that by the end of the session, you'll be able to appreciate exactly how implementation normally goes, understand what ISO 27001 is, and understand what information security management systems are. So this briefly is my profile. I'm a certified ISO 27001 senior lead implementer, and also a provisional auditor, and also most importantly belong to a KEBS technical committee, where we are part of the international, the ISO JTC1, that is the Joint Technical Committee 1 of ISO and IEC, Subcommittee 27, which is the committee, the international committee that deals with the standards that deal with the security techniques. And ISO 27001 and the ISO 27000 family of standards are just some of the standards that we normally look at in that committee. So I participate a lot, and I've been doing that for the past over 10 years. I participate in the creation, updating, review, and all that of all these management systems and systems that deal with IT security techniques. I've been in the IT industry for over 20 years, 10 of which have been in enterprise systems, with the wide experience in the private sector, public sector, government, in the finance sector, and also in education and training. Then I'll give us a brief overview of our company, that is Learned Consulting. Learned Consulting is an IT security consulting firm. We are a managed services provider, offering security, cybersecurity and data protection solutions for home, SME, and enterprise clients. And this Safari GRC is an approach that we have developed in-house for helping organizations to achieve resilience by ensuring that they have managed their IT governance, their risk management, and compliance requirements adequately. With the foundation of education, training, and awareness. We recognize that as a very, very important foundation for achieving organizational resilience. So these are the areas where we normally consult in and give solutions in: IT governance, risk management and compliance, that is IT GRC. So as we continue, I'll continue admitting in people who are coming in. So as you come in, just know that we have already started, but we are not going to verify it. And you are welcome to join the webinar. So I'll be pausing every now and then to admit people. So these are the consulting services that we offer in IT security, IT governance, risk and compliance. And we also do training. As we go, you'll see that information security awareness is one major requirement, especially for compliance and even as part of organizational resilience. And later on, I'll be talking about the kind of information security awareness that we normally offer. So I'll not go into details of that because I know we do not have a lot of time. We've got quite a number of slides that we need to cover. So those are things that I'll just leave for you to see, and then we'll continue. My connectivity is not that good. It's taking a bit of time to load the slides. So these are some of our strategic partners that we work with in the company. So we'll start right away by defining what is information security, so that everybody can be able to understand exactly what it is that we are talking about. And the most basic definition or description of information security is the preservation of your confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And this is normally referred to as the CIA triad. In the next slide, we are going to look more deeper into what exactly the CIA triad is all about: the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. That is the most basic thing that you want to do with information security. Now, other properties that we normally also look at is the authenticity of information, accountability, non-repudiation, and reliability. And the main aim that you want to have to ensure is basically to ensure business continuity. As we are managing information security, the main thing that you want is to ensure that your business continues and it's not disrupted by information security related incidences. And also you want to minimize business damage by preventing and minimizing the impact of security incidents. Security incidents will always be there. It is normally said that nobody can say that they cannot be hacked. So every now and then you always have to deal with information security incidents, and you need to be able to manage those incidents as they occur. So the CIA triad, these are the three basic components. That's just simple definitions: confidentiality, ensuring that information is made available, is not available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals. Now, these definitions are coming out of ISO 27000, sorry. And in a short while, we'll be able to understand where ISO 27000 comes in the wider scheme of things, because we are talking about the ISO 27000 family of standards. So we'll get to see exactly where ISO 27000 comes. And this is where we basically get the definitions of the terms that we work with and that we use in the information security. Then we have integrity, safeguarding the accuracy and completeness of assets. Later, we are going to see what are information assets. Then the availability, property of being able and being accessible and usable upon demand by authorized entities. So based on the kind of business that you're involved in and based on your environment, sometimes confidentiality can be more important than integrity and availability. In some organizations, availability and integrity can be less of importance, and you find that what you want to keep more important is the confidentiality. But in some instances, you can find that all three of them are normally critical and important. Sometimes one or two might be more important and more critical than the others. So other properties that you can be able to, that you want to be looking at on information security is authenticity, claiming, being able to verify that an entity is what it claims to be. And in authenticity, we are basically looking at issues to do with authentication and use of passwords and all that. Then we have accountability, the ability to trace actions performed on a system to a specific entity or user. You'd think in this instance, for instance, like finance systems, like maybe procurement and general finance systems, where you want to be able to know that you can be able to drive accountability to a person who performed a particular transaction in the system. Then there is the non-repudiation, where you have the ability to prove the occurrence of a claimed event or action and its originating entities. This is the property where if somebody sends you an email, or if you send somebody an email, so long as it is so long as it has a digital signature, then the recipient cannot say that they did not receive that email. And on the other end, you cannot say that you cannot deny that you are the one who sent that email. And this is normally found within our environment in Kenya. You'll find this in the Kenya Information and Communication Act, where the issue of non-repudiation and the issue of digital signatures and all that is normally defined. Then there is reliability, the property of consistent intended behavior and results. If you are running systems, you want your systems to be reliable. Then the other things that we can be looking at would be vulnerabilities, to just get a good understanding and a good handle of these issues, because these are the terms that are going to come up again and again, either when you're implementing your information security management system, or when, for instance, as you are going through this training, all these terms have to keep on coming up and again. So you have to be able to understand exactly what these terms mean. So a vulnerability is a weakness of an asset or control that can be exploited by one or more threats. And here what I'm giving is just types of vulnerabilities and examples of what those vulnerabilities would be. For instance, hardware like your servers, your laptops and mobile phones and all that can have the vulnerability of insufficient maintenance. Software systems can have the vulnerability of registration logs not being maintained. In your network, you can have the vulnerability of having a single point of access or single point of failure, where if somebody just breaches that to one point, then they're able to have access to your network. Then there are threats. These are potential causes of unwanted incidents, which may result in harm to a system or an organization. So threats, physical damage, examples would be fire, water damage, natural disasters like flooding and earthquake. So impact is the adverse change to the level of business objectives. And these would be defined in ISO 27005, which is a standard that deals with the IT risk management. We'll look at that in a short while. So for you to have impact, you'd have to have, it is basically what results in in risk. The risk is realized when a vulnerability, when a threat takes advantage of a vulnerability. And when that happens, then you have an impact to your operations. Then we have controls, which are means of managing risk, including these can be policies, they can be procedures, they can be guidelines or practices, or the general organization structure. So we put controls in place to manage your risks. And later on, we are also going to see where controls come in place. And you can be able to determine which kind of controls you want to put in place. In many organizations, even as you implement an ISMS or implement ISO 27001, you'll always find that there are certain controls that you've already put in place. Many organizations will normally have put in place things like password controls to manage authentication. Many organizations will already have put in place firewalls. Others will be using antivirus software, and all these are controls. The barrier that you have before somebody gets into your building, the fence that you put around your building, the processes that you put in place to ensure that not one person can be able to effect transactions in say a financial system, or that deals with procurement and payments and all that. All those are controls that you put in place. So it is important for us to know that organizations will normally have controls in place, but where the standard normally comes in, and where implementing an information security management system comes in, is for you to be able to ensure that there are no controls that you have left without being implemented. So you'll normally start off by doing a gap analysis to see which controls you already have in place, and you map that vis-a-vis the requirements of the standard. The requirements of the standard are what you are going to be looking at. So you'll be going through all those requirements vis-a-vis the controls that you've already put in place. And once you realize the gaps that you have in place, that you still have in your management system, then you're able to implement and determine what you need to implement to be able to bridge those gaps. And that way you're able to have a complete management system that is effective. Once that happens, then of course you're able to say that your management system conforms to ISO 27001. So again, just looking at risks, here we are looking at examples of information security risks. Information theft, when somebody hacks into your system and steals your information. Maybe you're working home and you lose your laptop, somebody breaks in your car. Loss of asset or functionality, denial of service. Whiteboards and flip charts that are left in meeting rooms and not covered, and when people come in, they're able to see maybe corporate strategies and that kind of thing. Telephone conversations that are normally held maybe in public places, and you have people eavesdropping and overhearing maybe information that they're not supposed to hear. And most critically also, there is social engineering, where people are tricked into giving information. All those are risks. Then what are information assets? So in IT security, an information asset is normally any data or device or other component of the environment that supports information-related activities. So for instance, people are normally taken to be part of information assets. And the critical thing to note here is that we are talking about information, not just technology, because there is a slight difference between IT security and information security. So with information security, we are talking about information assets. And information assets are basically any data or device or any component of an environment that supports the information-related activities. So the reports that you have, that you file, your premises is taken as part of information assets. The data that you have, of course, because the data is where most people really think that is what would be information assets. But even system documentation, contracts, computers, servers, etc., all that is information assets. Even the desk that you use to do your IT processing, that is also taken to be part of information assets. And this is important because we look at this when you're looking at risk assessment to see exactly how, when you're seeing exactly how the risk assessment process normally goes, you will see that it normally starts off with the defining information assets and having an inventory of what information assets are, because it is those information assets that you're going to be conducting risk assessments on, and it is those risk assessments that are going to give you what controls you need to put in place to ensure that all information assets have been adequately protected and all the risks have adequately been managed. So that definition is also very, very critical. Then you look at the types of information media, all these papers, databases, memory sticks, CD-ROMs and floppies, for those who are a bit older, conversation, all these are media where information is normally, can actually be found. And then you need to understand the information life cycle, where you create information, then you store, you distribute it to authorized persons, you can modify the information, and the modification is only by authorized persons. Then you can archive and you can delete information. This is the information life cycle. Now, the part of deleting is very critical because as many of you might know, we now have the Data Protection Act of 2019 in Kenya. This act is basically like our local GDPR, if I may put it that way. And what this law is all about is about privacy and data protection, protecting personal data that belongs to citizens who are to be found in Kenya, not just Kenyan citizens, but anybody who's resident in Kenya. And in that act, you'll find there's a clause that deals with the deletion. The right to be forgotten. So for instance, if you are an organization that collects personal information, the owner of that personal data can come to you and require you to delete that information. And of course, that will be within the legal provisions. It will be determined by a lot of things also, whether you still need to keep that information or whether the law requires you to keep that information or not. And in that case, if you're not required, then you have to delete that information. And you have to show proof to the owner of the information that you have actually deleted the information. So now that we've looked at the basics of information security and all issues and terminologies that are involved in information security, the next thing we want to look at is what is the information security management system, because now we want to take ourselves from those basics to understanding what is now an information security management system, and then on to see how the ISO 27001 can be used to implement an information security management system. And what you'll see here is that the SMS is not a technical process, it's a management process. So it is composed of many things. And being a management system, I want you here to think of it as the equivalent of a quality management system, because many people are familiar with ISO 9001, which is a standard that is normally used to implement quality management systems. So what we have is information security management system. And this one, the information management, security management system is normally based on a risk approach. And it's used to establish, implement, operate, monitor, review, maintain, and improve information security. So the reason why you are doing all these is basically to ensure that your information security is adequately managed. And as we'll see in some questions that some participants have asked at the end of the presentation, we'll see if it's a management process or not a technological process. So where should it be domiciled in an organization? Should it be in the IT department, or should it be led by maybe the HR department or the internal audit department or the legal department or that kind of thing? You'll be able to see that at the tail end of the presentation. So these are some of the benefits. The reason why the organizations would go out of their way and spend money and resources to implement ISO 27001 is because obviously there would be some advantages to be gotten out of it. There are some things that come out of it that benefit the organization in a big way. And these are just some of the ones that are there that I've listed here. You're able to protect shareholder value. If, for instance, a big company is hacked and data is stolen and they lose their brand value, then they end up losing shareholder value, because companies have been known to actually go out of business because of incidences that relate to information security. Of course, you're able to enhance your governance, in particular IT governance. IT governance is part of the wider corporate governance. And by implementing your information security standard and ensuring that it meets the requirements of the ISO standard, then of course it means that your governance is very effective and able to prove that. And critically also able to have predictable and effective responses to information security. When information security incidences happen, you're already prepared. When disasters happen, you're already prepared for them, because you'll have already implemented or put in place processes and policies and procedures to manage those incidences. Cost reduction, because you are implementing everything from a knowledge perspective. You have a lot of knowledge that you gather along the way, and this allows you to only implement what you need to implement and also do it in a more cost-efficient manner. Of course, you're able to improve your overall security, protect your brand and confidence with clients. In certain industries, your business partners or clients will require that you are ISO 27001. So unless you are certified to ISO 27001, then a potential business partner can decide that they will not do business with you, because the business, the kind of engagement that you're having with them is an engagement that requires a lot of confidentiality for information security. There's competitive advantage where if you have two potential business partners that you want to work with, you will most likely, a person will most likely, or another company for that matter, will most likely select one that is already ISO certified to the other, to one that is not ISO certified. And then there's compliance with contractual obligations and also legal and regulatory requirements. You will realize, as I've mentioned earlier, for instance, the Kenya Data Protection Act, it has a lot of controls that you are required to put in place. This is already law, and as I know we have some lawyers in the webinar. Lawyers will tell you that legal requirements are normally not suggestions. So for instance, with the Data Protection Act, now that it's already been enacted, all the controls that are put there, you have to implement them. Of course, depending on whether you're going to be registered as a data controller or a data processor, you have to comply with them. And one of the easiest ways of ensuring that you've complied with them legal and regulatory requirements is to implement ISO standards, be it in information security or in occupational health and safety, environmental management systems. All of them will normally put you in a very, very good position, because you'll find that the controls or the requirements that are put in the legal documents or in the laws will normally be covered by the ISO standards. So in a nutshell, ISO 27001 covers a lot of the controls that are required by the Data Protection Act. And if an organization will have implemented ISO 27001, they will most likely, maybe to about 90%, will have satisfied all the requirements of the Data Protection Act. The other regulations, for instance, if you're in the banking industry, central bank as a regulator has regulations and guidelines on IT security and information security, and all those requirements and the controls that they require organizations to put in place will normally be found in ISO 27001. So, and these are the steps that you normally go through to implement them. Sorry if I'm going to be a bit fast, it's because of we really have to manage the time since we don't have a lot of time. but I'll make sure that we cover what we are required to cover in this particular introduction. So the implementation steps, and I'll also share another document a bit later that shows exactly how that process normally goes. You normally first start by getting the commitment from your management. So, and here we are talking about the commitment of top management. This commitment to implement ISO 27001 would have to come either from the board or from the executive committee, the committee that is normally running the organization. But at least you have to be able to show, prove that the top management has authorized the implementation of information security management systems. And the reason why this happens is that because they have to own it. When you go to IT governance, you realize that the responsibility for the security of information is normally given to the top management. For instance, the guidelines that are normally given by the Central Bank of Kenya relating to information security, those guidelines are normally targeted at the board of directors. And it's for the board of directors now to ensure that that happens. And of course, appoint the people who need to implement that through the CEO. But of course, if something happens that relates to information security, like major breaches, the central bank basically talks to the top management, who is in this instance the board of directors. Then the next thing, once you have that commitment, you normally appoint a manager to implement the whole process. So it's sometimes you'll find organizations with an information security manager. Sometimes you'll find this defined as a role, and then that role is given to the IT manager or the chief information security officer or the chief technology officer or the director of IT. But the role has to be defined, and that is part of the requirements of the standard. The next thing you normally do is to define your scope of the ISMS. And by scope, you have to define, for instance, if it's an organization that has many branches, you have to define which branches are going to be covered by that ISMS. You have to define exactly which operations or which parts of the business are going to be covered by that ISMS. This is important because when the auditor comes to audit your management system, they are normally guided by the scope, and they'll only audit your management system based on the scope that you have. Now, the other point to note here is that for your scope, for your scope, for you to have the scope that is going to be auditable and of course certified, it is for you to define exactly what that scope is going to be. For instance, you can have an organization that only defines that, let's say it's a bank. We can have a bank defining its scope as this management system only covers the core banking system, and it only covers the headquarters and not the other branches. So when the auditor comes, then they will only audit the management system in as far as the core banking system is concerned, and in as far as the bank headquarters is concerned. So they will not be concerned about the other branches or the other systems that the bank may have. And it is important because when you get certified, then this is the scope that you get certified to. And in a situation where you have a client or a business partner who wants to know whether you are certified, then they'll also be looking at the scope that you have or the scope that you have certified, so that they can be able to see whether it covers all their requirements are. Then you would have to define your information security policy. Again, information security policy, it's very, very important for us to define this, because the information security policy is normally a one-page document that outlines what this management system covers and what is a commitment of the organization to securing information. Later, we are going to see how that normally looks like, but it should not be confused with all the other policies that an organization has to put in place, and processes and procedures. For instance, we have the password protection policy, or the password use policy, the internet use policy, or the network use policy. Those are other policies that are targeted at particular aspects of the business processes. But the one policy has to be there, which it outlines all the other policies and sets out or guides the organization in terms of its information security. Then you have to, the next thing you'll normally do is to have an inventory of your assets, define what your assets are. That's why we looked at assets earlier. Define all the assets that you have, of course, the assets that are going to be covered in the ISMS scope. Then after you define your assets, and of course, give ownership to those assets, you will normally conduct a risk assessment. A risk assessment is normally another large topic, but you are conducting a risk assessment to determine what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities and threats to the assets that you've defined, and what kind of controls are you going to put in place? What are the risks that, that would affect your information assets? Once you do that, then out of that risk assessment process, you normally have a statement of applicability and a risk treatment plan. Now, the statement of applicability is a document that's normally very, very unique to ISMS. There are no other management systems, for instance, like the quality management systems or environmental management systems that have or require a statement of applicability. It is only unique to information security. So your statement of applicability will normally state what your, what your controls are and how those controls are going to apply to the risk that you have identified. So you have identified your risk and you have identified the control that you are going to put in place to cover those risks. And this is normally a bit different from the risk treatment plan, because in the statement of applicability, you are simply saying which controls are going to be applicable to your management system and which ones are not going to be applicable. The reason for this is that when we look at, as we look at the standard itself, we see that it is made up of 10 sections, and then it has an annex called the Annex A, which is the one that normally has the controls. Now, you are required to implement those controls, but you are not mandated to implement all of them. So you can select the control that you want to implement and give a reason of why you want to implement those controls. And if there are certain controls that you do not need to implement based on your environment, because the standard is also subjective in terms of you have to study your environment, as we'll see in a short while, then you have to clearly state why you're not going to implement those controls. Maybe because you're not doing anything that is affected by that kind of control or that kind of risk. Then the risk treatment plan is simply a plan of exactly how you're going to implement your risk treatment. So you have identified the risks and you know the controls that you are going to implement. So you now have to say, these are the controls that I'm going to implement. I'm going to implement them by this particular period of time, and the person responsible for that is so and so, and this is the way it's going to look when that particular control is implemented. So you'll be outlining all the controls that you're going to implement and giving a treatment or plan of exactly how you're going to treat each and every of those controls that you are going to use to manage your risks. Once you've done that, then you normally develop an ISMS implementation program. This is basically where you really start to implement, because with your risk treatment plan, it normally gives you like mini projects of what you are going to implement. A good example would be, say you've identified that there's a big risk of your systems being hacked, your network being hacked, because you've seen their threats and their vulnerabilities, maybe it has single points of failure. Then you decide that you're going to implement a firewall. And you're going to implement a firewall by such and such a date, and the person responsible is the head of IT. So that is your treatment plan. Now that becomes a mini project in itself. So you will end up with a lot of small projects that you have to implement, and all these small projects are going to give you now the program for that you're going to implement, so that you end up with an ISMS that is workable. Once you have implemented all that, and you are not sure that you have done everything that you need to be able to manage, that is required of the management system, you then undertake internal audits to assure yourselves. And once you undertake internal audits, you'll do a management review to just see that everything that has been was mandated to be done has been done according to the requirements and in the most efficient manner. From that point, out of the management review, if, for instance, there are the corrective actions that needed to be taken out of non-conformities that were identified in the internal audit, then you're able to ensure that those corrective actions are implemented also. And once everything is done and dusted, then you're able to call in the external auditors who will come in and do the audit. And if you pass the audits, then you're able to give your certification. Once you give your certification, it's normally valid for 3 years. And every 1 year, it has the external auditor has to come in and do the audit again in what we normally call the surveillance audit, to just ensure that your management system is continuing to meet the requirements of ISO 27001. On the left, on the right, what we have is the supporting activities and resources. As you're going through the activities that we've listed on the left, you will have to do a lot of communication, you have to manage a lot of documentations, you have to put in place your project plans, internal audits and internal audit reports, your BCPs, incident management reports, and systems. You have to collect your logs and all that. You have to collect your metrics. We'll see later how we can be able to collect metrics and what can guide us. You have to be reviewing the laws and regulations that that affect your environment, and of course you have to have the standard itself. Part of the requirement to get certified is to actually have the standard, and also you have to put in place your policies and procedures. So a bit later we are going to see how you can be able to conform to the management system without having to get certified, because some organizations will normally determine that all they need to do is to implement the management system and make sure that the organization conforms to the management system, but they don't necessarily get certified and call external auditors, which is still acceptable from the perspective of simply wanting to make sure that you have managed your information security adequately. Sorry, this is exercise 1. And I just want you to just think about this, and then you can type your answers in the chat. I want you to think about the 2 most common information security mistakes that are made by individuals in your organization. If you can just type 2 of them in the chat, then you can think about the top 2 probable threats to your organization. You've already looked at what threats are. You can just let us know what would be the top 2 probable threats in your organization, and then we can be able to discuss those later. So now we are going to take a look at the ISO 27000 standard, so that you can be able to understand this family of standards. Sometimes it's normally very confusing to people. Many people will normally ask, what is the difference between ISO 27001 and ISO 27002? And this is where we are going to make that distinction very clearly. Sometimes people will ask, can I get certified to ISO 27002? Sometimes people ask, why do we have so many standards that deal with information security management systems? We'll answer that question. Information security is a very, very complex area, and we have various families, various standards that have been identified that can help you in implementation of security, of procedures and measures to ensure that your information is secure. So this family of standards include standards that define requirements for an ISMS and for those that certify those systems. So there will be standards that only give requirements. Others normally give direct support and guidance of or interpretation of how to implement the information security management systems, how to implement, how to maintain, and how to improve. Others will address the sector-specific guidelines for SMSs, because you'll find that, for instance, in the health sector, they might have slightly different requirements from what you'd find in the telecommunications industry. And by extension, those requirements would be slightly different from what you'd find in the finance industry. So there are certain standards that normally gives sector-specific guidelines. So on top of what you've implemented in ISO 27001, if, for instance, you're in the telecoms industry, For you to get certified, you still have to be graded by another standard that gives you further guidance on what else you need to do. Then there are those standards that normally address conformity assessment of your ISMS. So here we have just some examples of them. All these are some of the standards that you'll find in the ISO 27000 family. The first one is the vocabulary standard. And this is ISO 27000. ISO 27000 is actually a free standard. You can Google it and download it for free. It's important for us to know that all the other standards are standards that you have to buy. You have to go to the ISO website or the KEBS website and you look for the web store and you'll see where you can go to buy the standards. They don't come for free. And once you've bought, you are not required to share because it's normally copyrighted material and licensed to you only. So the vocabulary standard is free of charge. You can download it. It will normally give you all the definition of terms for all the other standards, all the terms that are used, what the definition of a threat is, what the definition of risk is, what definition of an information asset is, and it is that which guides you when you're implementing the other standards. Then there are the requirement standards. Most critically, there is ISO 27001. The critical point to note here is that this is the only standard that is certifiable. So even when you look at all these other standards, you will only get certified to ISO 27001. All the other standards come to help you. So the other requirement standards like ISO 27006, which is a requirement standard for bodies that audit information security management systems. For instance, organizations that audit and certify, they're called certification bodies of management systems. For a certification body of management systems that normally audits and certifies quality management systems, ISO 9001, there is a standard against which they must get certified themselves before they come to audit you and certify you. So for information security, that standard is ISO 27006. Any organization that claims or wants to become a certification body to audit other bodies, other organizations, and certify them, then they have to meet those requirements. Then there is ISO 27009, which also gives some other requirements for other bodies. Now there is the guideline standards. There is ISO 27002. Now this is the other very critical standard. And in a short while, we are going to see why it is a critical standard. ISO 27002 normally gives you guidance on how to implement ISO 27001. For instance, if you're implementing a control for a password policy, ISO 27002 will normally give you guidance on how those controls can look like. If you are establishing an information security policy, then ISO 27002 will guide you on how to do that. But it's not a requirement, it's not a must, it's just a guidance. All you need is to be able to show that you have met the requirement in ISO 27001. Then there is ISO 27003, which again is now this one guides you on how to implement the whole ISMS, not just how to implement the controls, but how now to implement the whole ISMS. So how to start the implementation process, what to do next, and that kind of thing. Then we have, again, it's not a requirement, just guiding, it's just advice. ISO 27004 will normally give you the metrics of how to measure, because measurement is a requirement of ISO 27001. So it will give you metrics, how to measure, what kind of metrics to use. It's guidance, advice, not a requirement. Then there is ISO 27005, which normally gives you a methodology for implementing risk management. Now, risk management for IT is normally slightly different from enterprise or operational risk management. But the point to note here is that your IT risk management methodology is normally guided by ISO 31000, which again is the standard for enterprise risk management. So as we're implementing ISO information security risk management, you have to be guided and you have to do it as a subset of the enterprise risk management methodology, where an organization has already implemented an enterprise risk management methodology. If they haven't, then that standard can also guide you, and it's now specific to information security. Then you have the sector-specific guidelines. We'll not go into all of them. And control-specific guidelines. Control-specific guidelines, you'd have, for instance, ISO 27032 is normally the standard for network security. So if you want to implement just network security and get guidance on how to do that, then that standard can give you very, very good guidance. There are very many. These are not even exhaustive, this list. If you go to ISO 27000, you'll actually be able to see all those standards. So as I said, let's not go deeper into these standards because we do not have all that time. If you take ISO 27000, it guides you through all those standards and exactly what each of those standards normally does. So our most important standard is going to be especially ISO 27001, which I said is the one that contains the requirements that you must meet. So everything in the standard is required. You have to meet everything that is outlined, and in a short while, that is going to be the next thing that we look at. Then ISO 27006 is the requirements for bodies that audit information security management systems. We look at ISO 27002. We will not look at it in detail, of course. This is the one that gives you guidance on how to implement controls. So as we look at ISO 27001, we see that it has 10 sections. We'll see that in a short while. And then after the 10 sections, it has what we call the Annex A. The Annex A normally contains controls that you are mandated to implement. So Annex A is normally mapped to ISO 27002, so that ISO 27002 now gives you guidance or guides you or advises you on how to implement the controls that are identified in Annex A. So you do not have to do it the way ISO 27002 tells you to do it. All you have to do is to show proof. For instance, if the requirement was to have a password policy, all you need to do is to show the auditor that you have an information security policy that meets the requirements of ISO 27001. Okay, then there is ISO 27003, which guides you on how to implement your information security management system. Again, just guidance. 27004, we said it's metrics. Guidance 27005 guides you on how to implement information security risk as a guidance and all that. 27007 is the guidelines for information security systems auditing. For instance, you have to do internal audit. You need to be guided by a standard. It's not a must, but this standard would be a very, very, very good point of departure. The people who also audit the certification bodies or the auditor who comes to auditor management system is also normally guided by a standard, which is also ISO 27007. So somebody will not just come and start asking you questions and doing whatever they feel like they want to do. They have to be guided by a certain standard. So now we look at ISO 27001 itself. So far, we've done about 50 minutes, so we are still doing well with time. We've got about 40 minutes more to go, and we should be able to go through these entire standard on a high level and be able to look at any other issues that are going to be there. So the ISO 27000, it's a very, very small standard, and it normally contains 10 clauses. Clause 0 is an introduction of the standard. Then clause 1 has the scope of the standard. Clause 2 normally has the normative references. It will give references to ISO 27000 and all the definitions of terms that are in 27000, therefore, normally take precedence in this standard. Then it will define terms that are not in ISO 27000. Then clause 4 up to 10, this is now the critical aspect. These are the mandatory requirements. So when you take the standard, since it's a certification standard, everything that is outlined in clause 4 up to clause 10 is mandatory. You have to do that. Then when it comes to Annex A, it is also a mandatory control. It's also a mandatory requirement, but the controls that are in Annex A, and it contains 14 control objectives and controls. You normally have to select the control that you want to implement. based on the risk assessment that you did. Remember the statement of applicability. Now, this is where you come and select the controls that you have to implement to be able to cover the risks that you've identified in your risk assessment. But as you select the controls that you're implementing, you have to give a reason why you're implementing those controls, and also give a reason why you are not implementing the controls that you're not implementing. So those two things are equally important. And if an auditor comes and finds that there's a control that you did not implement out of the 114 controls, and you have not given a reason as to why, maybe that kind of activity, okay, that kind of asset is not available in the organization and you normally don't do that, then of course you don't have to implement those controls. So you have to clearly outline why you're not going to implement certain controls. And many times it's normally hard to find an organization that has implemented all the 114 controls. There are organizations that will implement 50 controls, anywhere between 50 controls or even 20 controls up to 114. An organization will select the control that relates to the environment, and they'll implement those, and in the statement of applicability, they'll be able to give a reason why they have implemented the ones they have implemented, or why they will not implement the ones that they have chosen not to implement. Again, as I said, if you have questions, just put them in the chat. We'll look at them at the tail end of the presentation. So clause 4, now we look at the clauses from clause 4 to clause 10, because this is basically what forms the management system. So I'm going to go through those requirements, and I will not go through them in detail. I'll just be trying to give you a brief overview so that you're able to understand exactly what each and every clause normally talks about and what it normally covers. So clause 4 is a clause that deals with the context of the organization. And in that standard, you'll normally find the verb shall. So here, an organization wishing to comply with this standard shall at least do the following. The moment the standard says shall, means that you have to do these things that have been outlined. And there is none of those things that you are allowed to not do or say that you're not going to do. And basically what this clause is talking about is you have to understand your own organization, even as you implement your management system, because all organizations are different. You have to understand and document your activities and the kind of services you offer, the kind of products you do, the partnerships you have, your supply chains, your relationships and your interested parties. You define your internal and external environment and all that, so that you're able to clearly understand what your environment is all about, because it is only out of understanding your environment that you're able to come on now and implement a management system that covers everything that is within your environment. So the clause has 4 sub-clauses. 4.1 is understanding the organization and its context. 4.2 is understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, determining the scope of the ISMS. 4.3, remember earlier we talked about the scope. 4.4 is information security management system. You have to implement the information security management system. So as an example, if we can just take one of the clauses and see how can we be able to implement this? How can we ensure that we comply to the standard in as far as 4.1 is concerned? So 4.1 tells us that the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve intended outcomes, the intended outcomes of its SMS. And some of the tools that you can use to be able to achieve these is you can use checklists. You can do interviews with those interested parties. Checklists are where you have checklists that you give to people to tick and ask them questions about what their requirements are. You can do surveys, survey your users, both internal and external users. You can inspect what the organization does, and you can measure what the organization does in order for you to be able to determine what your external and internal issues are that are relevant to information security. So now, there's a methodology that we normally use ourselves. You are free to use any methodology that you want. And our methodology is normally used, done by integrating the project management body of knowledge for project management, where we have inputs, activities, and outputs. So for instance, for 4.1, understanding the organization and its context, the inputs to that would be the methodology that you select. you will have selected a methodology in 1.1 of this particular methodology, but whatever methodology that you selected to use in your implementation, that becomes part of what is going to guide you as an input to help you to understand the organization. Then you have to collect general information about the organization from maybe websites, annual reports, products and services, and the strategic objectives of the organization and the list of applicable laws and regulations. Then once you have those inputs, the activities or the processes that you'd have to do now is to understand your mission and objectives, values and strategies of, sorry, I'm using CENTAM, this presentation was done to CENTAM, it's your organization. Analyze your internal environment, analyze external environment, identify the key processes and activities, identification of infrastructure, identify and analyze interested parties, who are your customers, who are maybe regulatory authorities, identify business requirements that you may have, determine your objectives, and then you come up with a preliminary definition of what your scope is going to be. So when the auditor comes at the end of the day, they'll be looking at the scope, your preliminary scope, and that scope will be listing all those, and it will be showing that you have done enough work to be able to understand exactly what your organization is and what it is that your organization does. So these would be the outputs, description of the organization and its environment. You'll have a list of stakeholders and what their requirements are, applicable legal and regulatory and contractual obligations and all that. So that would help you now to have implemented 4.1 adequately, and you'd be able to have something that you can be able to show. Another issue that's normally very, very critical, that is also critical for this presentation, is the legal compliance. Part of understanding your organization is understanding what legal requirements you have. For instance, are you regulated by the Central Bank of Kenya? And as a central bank, therefore have some requirements that you must meet that regard information security. You'd want to look at, for instance, the Data Protection Act to see whether there are requirements that are there that relate to information security that you are mandated to meet. So you consider all those things, consider privacy and data protection, computer crimes that are happening, digital signatures, like in the ICT Act, intellectual property for contracts, maybe software use, software vendors, and licensing requirements, electronic payments that normally come with maybe the payment card industries, PCI DSS. Banks are normally regulated by this. And out of all that, you're able to see that you need to, that forms the context of your organization, which gives you even more reason why you need to implement the standard. Others would be regulatory frameworks, like industry best practices and regulatory frameworks that you can find in other places. Then clause 5 normally deals with leadership and approval of the ISMS. So again, remember I said from clause 4 to 10, everything is mandatory. So you have to show proof that you've done all this. So 5.1 is about leadership and commitment. You have to show, and there will be requirements for leadership and commitment. Of course, the details will be in the standard itself. Information security policy. 5.3, you'd have organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. For instance, 5.1 would be looking like this. Top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the ISMS. How would they do that? We'll be able to see that. Again, they are required to ensure that the ISMS policy and the ISMS objectives are established, and they are required to provide resources. They are required to ensure continued improvement of the ISMS, and they are required to ensure that intended outcomes are met. 5.2, information security policy. It would include some of these issues, like a framework that allows to define objectives and establish direction and policy guidelines for the management of information security. So we'll not go into the details of information security policy, but 5.2 is where now the information security policy is required. So it will guide you. If you go to ISO 27002, it will give you guidelines or advice on exactly how you can be able to ensure that your information security policy will meet the requirements. But so long as it meets all those things, then it will be admissible and it does not have to be done in that particular way. Then we'll be looking at clause 6. Clause 6, we'll look at it together with clause 8. This is where we do the risk assessment. This is where you do a lot of planning. So you have 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. Information security objectives and planning to achieve them. So for 6.1, it maps directly to the clauses that you'll see in clause 8, where now you have the process of risk management being detailed very, very clearly. So you have to show that you have put in place, for instance, subclause 6.1.1, the organization shall plan actions to address these risks and opportunities, and how to integrate and implement the actions into its ISMS and evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. We are talking about the actions to address risks and opportunities. Remember, we just talked about the statement of applicability and the risk treatment plan. These are the outcomes of the requirements of clause 6 and clause 8. So again, clause 6.1.2 deals with information security risk assessment. And it says that the organization shall define and apply an information security risk assessment process that establishes and maintains information security risk criteria and ensures that repeated information security risk assessments produce consistent, valid, and comparable results. Again, information security risk. Information security risk treatment is dealt with in clause 6.1.3, where the information security risk treatment process is said it must aid in selecting appropriate information risk treatment options. This is where you select your risk treatment options, and later we'll see exactly what kind of options that you're able to select. And determining that all controls that are necessary to implement information security risk treatment are chosen, and you compare the controls determined with those in Annex A and verify that no controls are being left out. Okay. Information security objectives and planning to achieve them. So you have to define your information security objectives. What is the objective of information security policy overall? Then out of that, you have to define the information security objectives of various information security, information assets and processes. And out of defining those, then you're able to determine what kind of controls you're going to put in order for you to achieve that information security objective. These are just examples or formulations of objectives related to the ISMS. For instance, you can say one of the objectives is to ensure compliance with legal, regulatory, and contractual obligations of the organization. Out of that, then you're able to determine what controls am I going to put in place to ensure that I comply with legal and regulatory requirements. Then clause 8 for operation, it deals with the information security risk assessment. You're mandated to perform information security risk assessments at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed to occur. A major change would be, for instance, a major change in business processes, or maybe an organization has bought a major asset that relates to information security. If you do that, then you have to perform the risk assessment so that, re-perform the risk assessment so that it incorporates the newly acquired asset or the newly implemented business process. Sometimes an organization will merge with another organization, and in that case, you have to redo the risk assessment to ensure that any risks that are coming out of that are taken into consideration. Then this would just be a brief introduction to risk assessment. We will not go into that, how the risk assessment process normally takes place. the actions, the activities for risk assessment, and what you'd have as the output. Then in clause 8, you'd have the the information security risk treatment. Remember the risk treatment plan. You've identified your risks, and you have a plan of the controls that you're going to put in place to manage those risks, so that you end up with a risk treatment plan. These are just some of the 4 options that we normally have as risk treatment options. You can either modify the risk, you can retain the risk, avoid doing an activity that is giving you the risk, or you can share the risk, for instance, by getting insurance and all that. The options that you take are determined by a lot of issues. So for you to determine whether you're going to modify a process or a control so that you're able to manage your risk will be determined by a lot of things that you have to take into consideration. Then in our methodology, you normally have the statement of applicability and the management decisions to implement the ISMS. So that is normally one of the end results of the risk assessment process, other than the risk treatment plan. We will not look at all that. Now we will look at a reference of security objectives and controls, just to understand how Annex A would be looking like. So this is just an extract of Annex A 6.1, which deals with internal organization. The security objective for A6.2 is to ensure the security of teleworking and use of mobile devices. And the control that you'd have to put in place would be 6.2.1 would be a policy supporting security measures shall be adopted to manage the risks introduced by using mobile devices. For instance, these are one of the controls in Annex A. Is very relevant to the current operating environment where a lot of people are working from home, and you have to be able to put in controls that guide how people access corporate networks when they are working from home, either using their mobile devices, or for 6.2.2, when they are teleworking, using your laptop to access corporate information assets, maybe corporate networks. So you can see from the objective to the control that are normally put in place. And of course, these are the issues that you'd have to make sure that they show up in the risk treatment plan. Then we have clause 7, which deals with resources. And this is where the top management is basically mandated to provide adequate resources to the implementation of the management system so that it succeeds. And it is a requirement, again, that is actually auditable, is the management providing adequate resources to ensure the success of information security management system. For 7.2, the top management will be required to ensure that the people who are managing the information security process and anything related to information security have the appropriate competence. So you're employing people who are competent. For instance, if it's your IT security manager, if it is your network security manager, if it's people working in IT, everybody is competent to handle the tasks that they are supposed to handle. Then there is 7.3, which deals with awareness. Again, the top management is required to ensure that all employees are made aware of the information security policy, and they are made aware of what their contribution is to the effectiveness of the information security management system, including the benefits of improved information security performance and the implications of not conforming with the information security management system requirements. For training methods, of course, you can use different training methods, either offsite workshops, online learning like we are doing right now. It is for an organization to select what training methods that they are going to use. There is none that is prescribed. And of course, you have to ensure that you have a security awareness program that will help you raise awareness and make sure that your employees are well aware of what they are required of. So these are just examples, main areas of what an awareness program would cover. You want to make sure that your employees are aware of the security policy, how to use passwords, how to protect against viruses, how to protect against social engineering, against phishing, how to respect intellectual property. All these are things that you need to have your employees knowing. And for us, as a small commercial break, we have a very good awareness solution. We've partnered with KnowBefore, and our awareness program is normally used to give you, you're able to get an information security awareness program in a very, very short period of time. And it's not just training users in a boardroom, but it's a program that also allows you to ensure that you're protecting your users against social engineering threats. And it's a program that starts by allowing you to do a baseline testing so that you can assess how phish prone your users are. If they are sent links to click, will they just click and then end up downloading and installing security malware into your systems that can put your networks into jeopardy? Then once you do the baseline testing, you normally train your users. And we have a very large library of security awareness training content in videos, games, posters, and newsletters. Then you continuously phish your users to see whether you're making progress, whether they are learning or not, and who is doing the training and who's not. And then you're able to see the results that you can be able to show to your top management, to show like where you started when you're doing the baseline testing, what kind of training you've done, who's done the training, how many trainings they've done, and how the phish prone percentage has changed over time. So at the end of the presentation, as I said, we have some free coffee. We'll be giving you a link to try the tool for free, so that in the organization you can be able to ask for a demo where you can give your proof of concept, so you can be able to see how the KnowBefore tool works. So Cloud 7 deals with communication. As you're doing all this, you have to adequately communicate with your users. So you have to determine what to communicate, when to communicate it, and with whom. It becomes part of your management system. Then there is the management of documented information. Documentation in all management systems is normally very, very critical. And your auditor, of course, depends a lot on the documented information that you have. There will be guidelines of how you can be able to ensure adequate documentation for your management system. This is just showing document management, what are the mandatory documented information in the standard. These are the ones that are mandatory. The ones that are next are not. The others that are normally, there should have been a slide showing the ones that are not mandatory but are normally good to have, like all the other information security policies and procedures. But these particular ones, you have to have them for your management system to be in conformity to ISO 9000, ISO 27001. So then we go to Clause 9, because now we have to move fast so that we're able to finish in time. Clause 9 deals with the performance evaluation. You're mandated to keep monitoring and measuring and analyzing and evaluating whether your management system is meeting what the requirements are and whether it's efficient or not. Then ISO 27004 is a standard that can help you with the management of the performance management. And it has 10 sections, and it is able to give you a good guideline of exactly how you can be able to implement performance management. You can easily be able to map the requirements in ISO 27001 and what is normally given in ISO 27004. So you can be able to see exactly how you're going to measure and get examples of measurement constructs. For instance, if you're measuring network performance, if you're measuring adherence to policies and all that kind of thing. Then 9.2 is about internal audit. Very critical, as I said earlier. Once you've implemented, you want to audit, have an internal audit. It is a requirement, and you have to be able to demonstrate that you've actually done an internal audit. There is normally a difference between an internal audit and an external audit. And the major difference with an internal audit is that the internal auditor can be able to advise on controls, what controls to be put, and the internal auditor is also concerned with the efficiency of how the controls are being implemented. But the external auditor is not interested in the effectiveness or the management system, then they just come to audit against requirements, and they cannot advise you on what you need to do. Those are some of the most critical differences. So then there is the management review. Once you do the internal audit, you have to perform a management review, which is basically the top management having a meeting to review how the management system has been implemented, whether the internal audit has been done, whether there are any non-conformities that have been picked out of the internal audit, and whether corrective actions have been implemented to correct those non-conformities. And once they do that, then they're able to say, then you can be able now to go for external audit. You can engage an external auditor to come in and do the external audit. So clause 10 is normally about improvement. This is where you deal with the non-conformities and corrective actions. So when you're doing the audits, whether it's internal or external, if an auditor finds a control that does not conform to the requirements, or are requirements that have not been implemented fully, or not, or maybe have only been implemented in part, then that becomes a non-conformity. And the auditor will normally flag that non-conformity. There is a process for managing non-conformities, and the non-conformity will normally be followed by a corrective action. So the corrective action is what needs to be done to ensure that the non-conformities has been corrected. And the corrective action plan then guides on all the actions that need to be taken by whom and by when. And it is only when these are taken that external audits normally happen. So we'll not go into the details of that. 10.2 normally deals with the continual improvement. You need to continually improve the suitability, the adequacy, and effectiveness of the information security management system. Here you can do monitoring, monitoring of processes or change factors, maintenance and improvement of the ISMS, continuous update, and improvement of documents. Then we do the external audit. Now, as you prepare for the external audit, you need to first ensure that you've selected the certification body. There are many certification bodies out there, so it's for you to select which certification body you want to use, so long as it's credible and respected. Then you prepare for the certification audit. Then you normally have a stage 1 audit, where the auditor normally verifies whether your documentation meets the requirements and whether there is need to proceed to stage 2 audit. On the stage 2 audit, the auditor will normally come to your location and now actually do the audit, look deeper into the documents, interview the people that they need to interview, and observe processes, whether you are doing what you have said you will do in your documents. Then there will normally be follow-up audits to validate whether action plans that are linked to any non-conformities have been done. And of course, a certification decision is made. If all the requirements are met, again, note it's all requirements have to be met for the certification decision to be made. Then the certification body issues you the certificate. And once that happens, every year they have to do a surveillance audit to just ensure that you are continuously doing what you are required to do. So as you prepare, it's good first to do a self-evaluation to see whether your processes are working appropriately, whether you've implemented all the things that you are supposed to implement. Then you prepare your personnel, have small training sessions with your people so that everybody knows exactly how to react to maybe questions to the auditors. You do some practice interviews, you review your documentation, and of course you can do a practice audit. This is where you can do the internal audit yourselves, or you can get an external consultant to come and do the internal audit for you. Just know that when you do the internal audit also has to be done a person who's qualified as an auditor and qualified in the management system, and that is part of the requirements. So now we'll do a few questions and answers. We've got 5 minutes to go. I don't know whether there is, we had some questions here that had already been placed by people, which are the ones first I want to just go through. And then I look at the chat to see whether there are other questions that people have posted there. How do you secure ISO certification? That is like what I've just talked about in the last slide. You have to go through that process, get an external auditor, he comes and audits you, and then if you pass the requirements, then they give you the ISO certification. This course is not for ICT specialists or professionals only. People who are in HR, who are internal audit, who are in legal professions, or any other areas of operations of an organization, it's normally important for them to go through this particular course. The other question was about government implementing ISMS. I know there has been requirements for government bodies to implement ISO 27001 in departments and MDAs, ministries, departments, and agencies. So in some places, this person is saying the SMS is placed in the HR department, others in the ICT department. My advice here would be, it is best placed in the ICT unit. The reason being that it's majority of the content here is about IT and information security. So even majority of the controls are IT related. So it is best to have this in the ICT unit. But as you form the implementation committee, you have to ensure that all the other business units are involved. So for instance, let's say an organization has appointed an information security management system manager, who also happens to be the head of IT or the director of IT. That person is going to do the implementation together with a committee, and that committee is going to be made up of the other heads of department. For instance, the head of HR, or the head of legal, the head of procurement, the head of finance, and that kind of thing. The only thing that they can do is to have representatives representing them in that committee. But my advice is it is best placed in the IT department. Again, there is no requirement that tells you exactly where it's going to be domiciled. The last question was the committee in various ministries or state departments supposed to train other staff members on this. Once they are trained on SMS, please guide us on the best way to handle it. The best way to handle it is simply to reach out to organizations like ourselves, and we'll be able to offer you training for ISO 27001. Many organizations will normally train champions, and those champions are able to go out and help other people in the organization. So this is the link that I talked about for free coffee. I'll just copy this and place it in the chat so that once you click on it, you'll be able to set up a demo for your organization, where you can be able to see how the Know Before tool for security awareness works, and determine whether that would add value to yourself.